No, no, we don't know. We're the Sunshine State. We're not the smart state.
He once made millions laugh from their living rooms. Now, he makes no one stop on the street. Mark Little was once one of the most familiar faces on Australian television. As the lovable, rough-around-the-edges Joe Mangel on Neighbours, he became a cultural icon, the kind of character you could never forget. But decades later, this same man was spotted performing comedy on the street, unrecognized and unseen, like a ghost from a television era long gone. Passers-by walked past without even a glance, unaware that the man trying to make them laugh had once been a household name. What happened to Mark Little? How does a man go from primetime television glory to performing for coins on a cold sidewalk in Edinburgh? His story is one of those forgotten showbiz tales, the kind that whispers behind the red curtains but never makes the headlines. Fame, as he would later confess, was never built to last. And for Mark, it unraveled quietly, tragically, and in full view of a world that simply stopped paying attention. In this video, we uncover the rise, the fall, and the haunting truths behind Mark Little's journey. From the golden glow of Neighbours to the invisible life of a street artist, this is a story of success, loss, and the brutal silence that follows when the applause fades. In the late 1980s, Australian television was undergoing a golden age. Family dramas and soap operas ruled the airwaves, and none was more beloved or more influential than Neighbours. Set in the fictional Ramsay Street, the show wasn't just a national phenomenon, it became a bridge between Australian and British pop culture. Among its rotating cast of young heartthrobs and dramatic matriarchs, one character stood out for his unconventional charm: Joe Mangel, played by Mark Little. Joe was brash but kind, clumsy yet endearing, the quintessential Aussie bloke. And Mark Little, with his unruly hair and unmistakable grin, didn't just play the role. He was Joe Mangel. Audiences connected with him on a personal level. In many ways, he was the emotional glue of the show during his years on screen, bringing comic relief and surprising depth. At the peak of his fame, Mark was adored by millions. The streets of Melbourne and Sydney were no longer places of anonymity for him. Fans approached him for autographs, media outlets chased him for interviews, and his face became a symbol of homegrown entertainment. It was the kind of recognition few actors in Australia ever truly achieve. But while the character thrived on screen, behind the scenes, Mark felt increasingly confined by the identity that had brought him stardom. Creative frustrations grew. He wanted more, not just better scripts, but space to express a wilder, more anarchic side of himself. He was never comfortable with being just a TV guy. The tightly structured world of serial television clashed with his rebellious streak, and soon, whispers began to surface about tensions on set. When he abruptly exited Neighbours, many assumed it was just another casting change. But for Mark, it was a statement. He wasn't going to let himself be boxed in. He was ready to take a risk, to leave behind certainty and fame for artistic freedom. What followed was a journey that would take him far from the sun-drenched suburban sets of Australian television to the underground comedy clubs of Britain. At first, the move seemed bold and promising. Mark found stages to speak his truth, darker, edgier, and far more political than anything he'd done before. He appeared in avant-garde shows, challenged audiences, and redefined himself as a provocateur rather than a crowd pleaser. But the spotlight is fickle, and the transition from mainstream celebrity to fringe performer is rarely forgiving. Over time, Mark Little's name began to fade from the headlines. While some of his contemporaries, Kylie Minogue, Guy Pearce, Jason Donovan, soared into international stardom, Mark's journey veered in the opposite direction. Gigs became sporadic, press coverage dwindled, and the industry he once ruled now barely remembered him. It wasn't until years later, when he was spotted performing comedy on the streets during the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, that people began asking again, "Isn't that Joe Mangel?" But by then, most had forgotten. Mark Little didn't begin as a traditional leading man. He was rough-edged, unpredictable, and carried an energy that couldn't be easily tamed. A far cry from the polished TV personalities that dominated screens in the 1980s. Born in Brisbane in 1959, he grew up in a working-class environment, absorbing the sharp wit and no-nonsense honesty that would later define both his comedy and his characters. He studied drama, yes, but more importantly, he lived life with the hunger of someone who didn't want to be ordinary. His big break came in 1988 when he stepped into the role of Joe Mangel in Neighbours, replacing the original actor who played the character for only a short stint. Audiences were instantly drawn to Mark's version, a flawed, emotionally vulnerable single dad with a loud mouth and a heart of gold. Joe wasn't glamorous, but he was real. For many viewers, he represented a familiar archetype, the struggling, decent man doing his best with what he had. And Mark, with his gift for both slapstick comedy and sudden pathos, brought the character to life in a way that made Joe unforgettable. Almost overnight, Mark became a sensation. Neighbours had a massive following in the UK, and his face became just as recognizable in London as it was in Melbourne. He won a Logie Award for Most Popular Actor in 1990, a public vote that reflected just how deeply audiences connected with him. But as his fame grew, so did his discomfort. The longer he stayed on the show, the more he felt boxed in. Behind the scenes, he struggled with the formulaic writing and the constraints of serial television. He began to crave something more radical, a chance to speak directly to audiences, not as a character, but as himself. That's when he started writing and performing his own material on the side. Surrealist comedy, political satire, monologues that were sometimes funny, sometimes uncomfortable. He was trying to tell stories that didn't fit within the cheerful borders of Ramsay Street. Then, in 1991, Mark made a bold decision. He walked away from Neighbours. He left behind fame, stability, and a steady paycheck, all for the unknown. At first, it seemed like the gamble was paying off. Mark relocated to the UK and quickly carved out a new identity. He became a regular face on British television, most notably as the host of The Big Breakfast, where his offbeat humor and anarchic presence won him a cult following. He also became a staple of the Edinburgh Fringe circuit, presenting one-man shows that blurred the lines between comedy and performance art. But the entertainment industry is a fickle beast, and Mark's niche was not easy to sustain. The very qualities that had made him unique, his refusal to conform, his unfiltered honesty, his disdain for celebrity culture, gradually became obstacles. Producers wanted reliable personalities, not rebellious wildcards. Mainstream TV moved on, and in the relentless cycle of fame, those who don't adapt are often left behind. By the late 2000s, Mark's visibility had faded significantly. He still worked, mostly in live theater, alternative comedy, and the occasional guest appearance. But the name Mark Little no longer carried the weight it once had. In Australia, he was remembered vaguely as that guy from Neighbours. In the UK, he was a curious footnote in 1990s pop culture. And yet, Mark refused to disappear. He continued to create, to perform. Even if the venues were smaller, the crowds thinner, the paychecks laughable. In 2019, he made an unexpected return to Neighbours, reprising Joe Mangel for a few episodes. It was a fleeting moment, a nostalgic cameo that reignited brief interest. But behind the scenes, Mark had already come to terms with something far more personal, that fame is an illusion, and chasing it is a path paved with loneliness. Not long after, during a comedy performance at the Edinburgh Fringe, he was seen performing outside a small venue. No stage, no lights, no fanfare. Just a man on a corner, talking to a crowd that didn't know who he was. Some stopped to listen. Most didn't. And in that moment, the contrast between who he was and who he had become could not have been more stark or more tragic. It wasn't just obscurity that haunted Mark Little in the years after his fame faded. It was invisibility, the kind that sinks in slowly, like dust creeping into a once bright room. For a man who had once made millions laugh, being ignored was not just painful, it was existential. In a rare and deeply revealing interview during one of his later Fringe performances, Mark said something that struck a chord with those who still remembered him. Open quote, "There's a special kind of silence that happens when you're performing your guts out, and no one even looks up," close quote. That silence became symbolic of his post-fame reality. He wasn't just overlooked, he was erased. Not vilified, not disgraced, simply forgotten. He had never chased tabloid headlines or scandal. There were no arrests, no overdoses, no violent breakdowns. His disappearance from the public eye wasn't caused by controversy, but by a slow and quiet dismantling, a refusal to play the game that others mastered. While fellow castmates played into the machinery of fame, Mark pulled away from it. In doing so, he lost the very spotlight that had once made him matter. And then came the rumors that he was broke, that he was sleeping in hostels during fringe festivals, that he had tried to pitch shows and been turned down repeatedly, that his performances were becoming more bitter, more erratic, filled with rage against the industry, against the media, even against the audience themselves. Whether those whispers were true or not, they stuck. People love a fallen star, but only when they crash with fireworks. Mark faded, and no one noticed. The harshest moment came not from the press, but from the streets. During a 2017 performance in Edinburgh, a passerby recorded a short clip of Mark ranting in character outside a venue. The video was uploaded with the caption, "Weird old man doing stand-up in the gutter." The comments section was brutal. No one recognized him. No one knew they were mocking a man who once held a Logie award in his hands. No one cared. It wasn't long before the clip reached a few former fans who did remember. And suddenly, a few headlines popped up. From Ramsey Street to the streets, what happened to Mark Little? Joe Mangel's tragic fall from grace. But by then, the narrative had already written itself. Mark was no longer the beloved underdog. He was a cautionary tale. And yet, through all of this, he never stopped performing, never stopped speaking, never stopped creating. In 2022, he did a deeply personal one-man show titled The Lie of the Land, confronting Australia's political failures, the media's decay, and yes, his own disillusionment. It was raw, angry, poetic. Few showed up, fewer wrote about it, but those who did walked away shaken. Behind the humor, behind the fading celebrity, was a man laying bare the dark truth of the entertainment world. It uses people up, then discards them. Not with cruelty, with indifference. Mark Little's story is not one of disgrace. It's one of abandonment, of what happens when you stop conforming to what fame demands, when you step off the stage, only to realize no one's watching anymore. Mark Little's story is not easy to categorize. It's not a clean arc of rise and fall, nor a redemption tale with triumphant return. It's messier, it's quieter, and that's what makes it so devastating. At Aussie Uncovered, we believe Mark Little represents something rarely discussed in the entertainment world: the price of authenticity. He didn't crash and burn because of scandal. He wasn't undone by addiction or crime. He simply stepped away from the manufactured persona that brought him fame, and found that the world, without that persona, had no place for him. There's something brutally honest in the way he rejected the glitz of long-running TV success. He could have played the game. He could have milked the Joe Mangel brand, stayed within the system, coasted on nostalgia. But instead, he pursued art. Raw, political, confrontational art. And in doing so, he stepped out of sync with an audience that had once adored him. Some might call that foolish. We call it brave. But bravery doesn't pay the rent. And Mark's later years tell a painful truth about what happens when fame fades and the world moves on. There are no safety nets for the once famous, no retirement plans for the cult figures of yesterday. There's just silence. And if you're lucky, maybe a handful of people who still remember you as something more than a trivia question. For those of us who grew up watching Neighbours, seeing Mark Little dismissed as a weird guy on the street stings. Because we remember the laughter, the warmth, the oddball charm of Joe Mangel. And we remember Mark himself, not as a failed celebrity, but as a fiercely intelligent artist who never stopped trying to matter. The question we pose to you, the audience, is simple. What do we owe to the people who once made us laugh? Do we forget them the moment the credits roll? Do we allow their legacy to be buried under the weight of cultural amnesia? Or do we look back, not with pity, but with respect, and say he mattered? We at Aussie Uncovered believe he did. What about you? There's something haunting about a man once adored by millions, now performing to no one. Not because he failed, but because we forgot. Mark Little never stopped being Mark Little. He never changed his voice, never chased the artificial shimmer of celebrity. He simply kept creating, kept talking, kept pushing. But when the audience left, he was still there, on the street, in the theater, under the dim lights of small venues, whispering stories into the dark, hoping someone was still listening. He was Joe Mangel once, the clumsy, lovable single dad who brought heart to Neighbours. For a time, that name meant something. It was part of the daily rhythm of Australian life, woven into the fabric of pop culture. But as new shows came and younger stars emerged, that memory faded, not with anger or rejection, but with time. And maybe that's the cruelest part. Not that Mark Little was mocked, not that he was rejected, but that he was ignored, as though none of it had ever happened. But we remember. We remember Ramsay Street. We remember Joe's awkward hugs, his wild hair, his lovable clumsiness. We remember the Logie speech, the laughter, the strange but brilliant run on the big breakfast, the fire in his political rants, the quiet pain behind his later performances. And now, knowing what came after, the silence, the struggle, the sidewalk shows. The laughter feels different, more fragile, more sacred. Some stories are never told. But now you know. Mark Little may never return to screens, he may never chase headlines again, but somewhere out there, he's still performing, still creating, still refusing to disappear quietly. Because for artists like him, the applause never mattered as much as the truth. And that truth, raw, brave, and unapologetically human, is his legacy.